Nike just chose a 21-year-old wildcard over the world's most dominant tennis player, and the internet has completely lost its mind. A $60 million decision, one signature deal, and Aryna Sabalenka, the reigning world number one, was nowhere on that contract. Nobody inside the boardroom expected the story to detonate the way it did. A brand that had dressed Sabalenka in borrowed outfits, duplicated her custom kits on qualifying round strangers, and publicly embarrassed the most powerful woman in tennis, suddenly turned around and handed the throne to a 21-year-old girl from Manila who wasn't even in the top 100 12 months ago. This is not just a sponsorship story. This is about power, pride, and the cold mathematics of who the future of women's tennis truly belongs to, and why Nike made a $60 million bet that it isn't Aryna Sabalenka. Stay until the very end, because the final chapter of this story will genuinely surprise you. To understand why this decision sent shockwaves through the entire women's tennis world, you have to first understand exactly what Aryna Sabalenka has built, because dismissing what she has accomplished would be intellectually dishonest, and this story demands honesty above everything else. Aryna Sabalenka did not drift to the top of women's tennis. She clawed, she screamed, she shattered rackets, she served bombs at 133 miles per hour, and she rebuilt her entire game from the foundation up after a serve yip that would have ended lesser careers. She arrived at the 2023 Australian Open carrying the psychological weight of a chronic double fault problem that had haunted her for 2 full seasons, and she won the whole tournament. She came back in 2024 and won it again. Then she conquered the US Open. Then she won it again at Flushing Meadows in 2025. 4 Grand Slam titles, year-end world number one, not once, but twice in a row. Sabalenka finished 2025 having held the top ranking for the entire calendar year, every single week, uninterrupted. She won the WTA Player of the Year award for the 2nd consecutive time. She became only the 2nd player since Serena Williams to reach the semifinals of all 4 Grand Slams in a single season. These are not statistics manufactured for effect. These are permanent entries in the historical record of the sport. And her relationship with Nike? It stretches back to 2017. 8 years of loyalty, 8 years of wearing the swoosh on center court at every major tournament on the planet, through the serve crisis, through the personal tragedies, through the championships and the heartbreaks. She publicly celebrated when Nike finally gave her a custom US Open kit in 2023, posting on Instagram with genuine, unfiltered excitement. She had waited years for that moment. So the question that hangs over everything that follows is devastatingly simple. If Aryna Sabalenka, 4 Grand Slam titles, world number one, 8 years of brand loyalty, cannot secure a signature athlete deal from Nike, what exactly does a woman have to do? Because Nike apparently had an answer, and that answer wore a sampaguita flower in her hair. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. This story gets significantly more complicated before it gets cleaner, and you do not want to miss where this goes. Alex Eala was not supposed to be here. Not yet. Not this fast. She grew up in Manila, the daughter of a former national swimmer, trained at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Spain at age 12, and quietly assembled one of the most decorated junior careers in the modern history of women's tennis: Grand Slam junior singles champion, multiple junior doubles titles, a relentless work ethic whispered about in locker rooms across 3 continents. But junior trophies do not pay professional bills, and the jump from prodigy to professional force has broken far more talented players than it has ever elevated. Eala entered the 2025 Miami Open ranked 140th in the world. She had no business being in that draw without a wild card. She had no business defeating Jelena Ostapenko. She certainly had no business defeating Madison Keys, a Grand Slam champion, in straight sets. And she absolutely had no business walking onto the court against Iga Swiatek, three-time French Open champion and former world number one, and dismantling her in consecutive sets without surrendering the initiative for a single sustained sequence. But she did all of it, and she did it while an entire nation watched from 12 time zones away, staying awake until 3 in the morning, weeping in living rooms, flooding social media with raw, unprocessed national pride of a kind that professional sports rarely manufactures anymore. Sky Sports presenter Gigi Salmon, watching from courtside in Miami, described the atmosphere around Eala as resembling a pop concert, like Taylor Swift was playing. Players approaching their own matches reportedly apologized to crowds they knew had not gathered to watch them. Nike had signed Eala in 2019, when she was barely a teenager, before anyone outside Philippine tennis had heard her name. That early investment was standard speculative practice for a brand with the resources to bet on 50 futures and cash in on the 3 that materialize. What nobody at Nike's headquarters anticipated was the velocity of the return. When Eala made her Wimbledon debut in July 2025, Nike did something that stopped the fashion and sports worlds simultaneously. They gifted her a custom hair tie shaped as a sampaguita blossom, the national flower of the Philippines. It was a gesture of specific, researched, culturally intelligent branding that communicated something far larger than a hair accessory. It communicated investment, identity, a narrative architecture being deliberately constructed around a single athlete. 1 month later, Nike released a limited edition shirt designed by Filipino artist Georgina Camus, featuring the sampaguita flower overlaid on the grass courts of Wimbledon. It sold out. The cultural conversation around Eala expanded beyond sports entirely, into fashion, into diaspora identity, into the kind of multi-platform storytelling that modern brands would write dissertations about. Nike was not dressing a tennis player. Nike was building a global icon, and the $60 million signature contract reportedly being assembled around Eala represented the culmination of that architectural project, a figure that would make her not just the highest-paid Filipino athlete in history, but one of the highest-paid women in the entire sport. Here is where the narrative fractures into something genuinely uncomfortable, because Aryna Sabalenka did not absorb Nike's escalating investment in Eala quietly. She said something publicly that should not be underestimated, and the tennis world largely failed to treat it with the gravity it deserved. At the 2025 WTA Finals, the season-ending championship reserved exclusively for the 8 best players alive, Sabalenka stood before a room full of journalists and delivered a message to her own sponsor. She stated, with a calmness that barely concealed the frustration beneath it, that 2026 would not be a special year with Nike. Then she did something remarkable. She directly asked the media to apply pressure on the brand. A world number one, standing at the summit of her sport, publicly lobbying journalists to hold her sponsor accountable on her behalf. Read that again, because it matters enormously. Nike had given Carlos Alcaraz a custom personal logo, unveiled at the 2025 ATP Finals. They had built signature identities for Jannik Sinner. They had constructed entire visual universes around male athletes who had achieved a fraction of what Sabalenka had accomplished across the same time period. Sabalenka had 4 Grand Slams. She had back-to-back year-end #1 rankings. She had arguably the most charismatic, most commercially compelling personality on the entire WTA Tour. And Nike's answer was 2026 will not be special. Then came the outfit scandals. Plural. Repeated, humiliating. At the 2025 French Open, another player walked onto the clay wearing a kit nearly identical to Sabalenka's custom Roland Garros dress. Fans exploded on social media. Nike said nothing publicly. 3 months later, at the U.S. Open qualifiers, it occurred again. A qualifying player photographed in an outfit that mirrored Sabalenka's bespoke design so precisely that fans began posting comparison photos side by side. The reactions were incendiary. They always do Aryna dirty, one viral post declared, accumulating thousands of engagements within hours. This is so embarrassing from Nike. If you're not making a custom kit for your world number one and defending champion, at least make sure no one is wearing her kit. Nike's response was institutional silence. No statement, no acknowledgement, no apology. The world number one's exclusive visual identity, the thing that distinguished her from every other player on every court on the planet, was being duplicated on unknown qualifiers, and the brand responsible collected its silence like revenue. The tension between Sabalenka and Nike had been building for years. Her move from IMG to Naomi Osaka's Evolve agency at the beginning of 2025 sent an unmistakable signal that she was restructuring every professional relationship around her. Someone inside that circle was not delivering, and the evidence was accumulating in plain public view. The question forming in every boardroom that follows sports business closely is the same question forming in yours right now. Why would Nike treat a 4 Grand Slam world number one this way? The answer is more calculated and more revealing than you might expect. Understand something fundamental about how Nike operates at the highest level of sport. They do not purchase what players have already accomplished. They purchase what players will make possible in the future. Every signature deal, every custom logo, every cultural investment of the magnitude being built around Alex Eala represents a calculated projection of commercial return extending across a decade or more. Eala is 21 years old. She is at the peak of her powers, and the evidence suggests those powers will remain formidable for several more seasons. But peak powers in Nike's projection models are not the same as ascending powers. A brand does not generate maximum return by signing the player everyone already knows. It generates maximum return by signing the player the world is in the process of discovering. The emotional arc of discovery is commercially irreplaceable. Once the discovery has concluded, the narrative energy dissipates. What remains is maintenance, not momentum. Eala is 21. Her discovery narrative is not only incomplete, it has barely begun. She entered the top 100 in March 2025 as the first Filipino to ever achieve that milestone. She won her first WTA 125 title in September 2025. She has never reached a WTA 1000 final, never reached a Grand Slam quarterfinal, never competed for a major title. In conventional tennis analysis, she is a promising mid-level professional with exceptional ceiling potential. But Nike does not operate in conventional tennis analysis. Nike operates in global market architecture, and the mathematics of Eala's global market are staggering. The Philippines has 115 million citizens. The Filipino diaspora spans the United States, the Middle East, Europe, Japan, and Southeast Asia in numbers that dwarf comparable national communities. Her fan base demonstrates physical mobilization, traveling internationally to attend her matches, flooding practice sessions at tournaments, creating the kind of organic, authentic crowd energy that no marketing budget can manufacture. At tournaments in the Middle East in early 2025, the scenes around Eala were described by tennis journalists as unprecedented for a player outside the top 50. Then factor in the broader Southeast Asian market, one of the fastest-growing consumer economies on Earth, historically underserved by global sports brands in terms of authentic regional representation. Eala does not simply represent the Philippines, she represents the aspirational identity of an entire hemisphere that has never seen one of its own compete at this level of global women's tennis. Sabalenka's market, by contrast, carries complications. The ongoing war in Ukraine has created documented commercial hesitancy around Russian and Belarusian athletes that multiple industry analysts have cited explicitly when discussing why Sabalenka's endorsement portfolio lags behind players with inferior competitive records. Nike operates in a global commercial environment where brand adjacency to geopolitical controversy carries measurable financial risk. That is not a moral judgment, It's a business calculation, and it has consequences. The $60 million figure attached to Alex Eala's reported signature deal is not arbitrarily inflated. It represents Nike's projection of what her commercial ceiling generates across a decade of ascending narrative in markets where Nike's penetration is currently incomplete, with a cultural resonance that signature athletes like Alcaraz, Gauff, and Swiatek, extraordinary as they are, cannot replicate.
The announcement detonated across tennis social media with the velocity of something that had been pressurized for a long time. Sabalenka supporters, a devoted, vocal, globally distributed community, treated the news not merely as a corporate decision but as a verdict, a statement from a powerful institution about whose story deserved investment and whose story had been rendered sufficient. The comparisons were immediate and devastating in their clarity. Alcaraz had his logo, Sinner had his identity architecture, Federer had spent 2 decades as arguably the most elegantly branded athlete in the history of the sport, and Sabalenka, who had achieved more in the last 3 years than any woman in the sport not named Iga Swiatek, was watching a 21-year-old wildcard receive the commercial recognition that 8 years of loyalty and 4 Grand Slam titles had apparently failed to earn. Sabalenka's switch to Evolve, Naomi Osaka's management agency, suddenly read differently in retrospect. Osaka herself had experienced the precise intersection of mental health vulnerability and brand power dynamics that can define or destroy an athlete's relationship with major sponsors. Building a management infrastructure around someone who understood that terrain from lived experience was not accidental. It was strategic preparation for negotiations that were already failing. The conversation inside professional tennis circles touched something larger than individual contracts. Female athletes in women's sports have documented, studied, extensively evidenced disparities in sponsorship investment relative to their male counterparts. Disparities that persist even when women's commercial value has been demonstrably proven. Sabalenka's situation gave that abstract structural argument a specific, named, undeniable human face. When fans posted that Nike always does Aryna dirty, they were not venting empty frustration. They were articulating a pattern that the evidence supported. The duplicated outfits, the absent signature status, the 2026 non-commitment, the $60 million redirected to a player with a fraction of her titles. Each data point alone was dismissible. Together, they formed something harder to argue against. Inside the WTA, the dynamics between ALA and Sabalenka had never been openly antagonistic. Sabalenka had spoken about younger players with characteristic directness, but without hostility. But the commercial narrative being built around Eala, amplified by Nike's investment, was repositioning the two women inside a competitive frame that neither had constructed and neither fully controlled. Marketing narratives have their own gravity. Once the story becomes the future replacing the present has very little leverage over how the story ends. And here is the part of this story that almost nobody is talking about, the part that makes this more than a sponsorship dispute, more than a rivalry, more than a business calculation. Stay with me. Strip away the commercial figures, set aside the competitive records, remove the geopolitical calculations and the market projections and the diaspora demographics. What remains at the center of this story is a question that women's sport has been asking for decades without receiving a satisfying answer. What does it take? Aryna Sabalenka gave 8 years of loyalty to a brand that duplicated her custom outfits on anonymous qualifying players and then declined to commit to making 2026 special for her. She gave 4 Grand Slam titles. She gave year-end #1 twice. She gave personality, charisma, a story of genuine adversity overcome with genuine resilience. She moved to a new agency to fight harder for the commercial recognition her record demanded. And the response was a $60 million signature investment redirected to a 21-year-old who had won 1 WTA 125 title. Nike's decision is defensible by every principle of modern brand architecture. Eala's commercial potential is real, enormous, and structurally distinct from anything Sabalenka's rocket profile can currently offer. The sampaguita hair tie was not a stunt. It was the visible surface of a deep and intelligent investment thesis. The Filipino artist collaboration was not tokenism, it was the proof of concept for a decade-long storytelling project. Nike is not wrong about Eala, but being right about Eala does not require being indifferent to Sabalenka. That is the tension that makes the story genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply fascinating. The commercial logic is coherent, the human logic is fractured. What Alex Eala represents, and this must be said with full understanding of its weight, is not merely Filipino national pride or Southeast Asian market penetration. She represents the specific, radical possibility that a young woman from a country that has never produced a professional tennis force can arrive at the highest level of the sport and be treated from the very beginning as someone whose cultural identity is worthy of investment rather than erasure. The sampaguita blossom on a Wimbledon hair tie is a statement that identity and excellence are not in tension, that a girl who grew up watching tennis from Manila can wear her nation's flower on the most prestigious courts in the world, and a global brand will amplify rather than dilute that. That matters enormously, regardless of what it costs Sabalenka. Sabalenka's trajectory is not finished. Her competitive record will continue accumulating. Evolve will negotiate with aggression. The market will eventually correct the gap between her commercial value and her commercial recognition, because that gap, sustained long enough, becomes a negotiating lever rather than a permanent condition. Nike notes this. The conversation is not over. But the $60 million has already moved, and the era it inaugurates, in which a player from Southeast Asia receives the kind of investment historically reserved for Americans and Europeans, is now permanent, regardless of what happens in any boardroom going forward. Eala and Sabalenka will continue competing on the same courts, inside the same tournaments, at the same Grand Slams. Their stories will intersect repeatedly across the years ahead. One is ascending toward a summit whose height nobody can currently measure. The other is defending a throne with a ferocity that 4 major titles can barely contain. Nike has placed its bet. The courts will adjudicate the return. Was this the birth of the most consequential rivalry in modern women's tennis, or simply a brand decision that revealed something uncomfortable about how women athletes are valued when the commercial mathematics shift? Drop your perspective in the comments, because the debate forming around this story is more revealing than the story itself. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is already being written, and you'll want to be here when it arrives.